youtube.com/booktv. And now Yvonne Haddad, author of Becoming American, The Forging of Arab and Muslim Identity in Pluralist America. She sat down with Book TV to talk about her book and her work at Georgetown University. This is about 20 minutes.
And now joining us on Book TV is Professor Yvonne Haddad, and she is the author of this book, Becoming American, The Forging of Arab and Muslim Identity in Pluralist America. This is published by Baylor University Press. Professor Haddad, when did Muslims start coming to the U.S.?
It depends. Some people think they were here before Columbus. Some people think that at least one of them came with Columbus. But a concentrated group started coming in the 1870s.
Why?
But mostly from Lebanon, because there was famine and the young people were looking for work. They were in Lebanon engaged in raising silkworms for the silk industry. And there was a blight, and the mulberry trees died, and so they couldn't raise any more silkworms. But the other thing that happened is that Japanese silk began to compete, and so the industry fell apart. So they started coming.
What was the reaction in 1870s when Arabs and Muslims first started coming to the U.S.?
Well, they came in as peddlers. I mean, they weren't really part of the sort of main trade and industry, but they began to sort of peddle little trinkets to farmers. You know, we have documents that show they went, for example, into Connecticut in Springfield, and there was this woman who ran away from Lebanon to avoid being married to an 80-year-old man. So she opened a store, and they would come. They knew no Arabic. They would have her name and her address, and it would be pinned on their jacket, and somebody would put them on the train from New York, and they'd end up in Springfield, and she'd fit them up with a peddling thing, and they'd go out. And then Sears Roebuck came, and Sears Roebuck began to deliver to the rural areas, and therefore that business sort of came to an end. So they started opening stores and began to settle.
How were they strong Muslims at that time? Or was it more of a secular?
They were mostly rural people. I mean, the first Arabs to come were Christian. And then 10 years later, the Muslims began to come, because basically some of these Arab Christians would go back, they would have money, they'd build these houses with red tiled roofs, and everybody could see they made money in America. And so you begin to have Muslims reluctantly at first coming. We know of one record, one guy was getting on the ship, and he asked them if there were mosques in America, and they said no, so he got out. But the others came, and they were basically migrant labor. They came in to make money and go back. They didn't come to settle.
When were there other times in U.S. history when waves of Muslims came to the States?
Well, some came after World War I. There's a short period of time, but by 1924, the United States put quotas, and only 100 people from the Middle East could come to the United States per year. And they had to be relatives of people who were already here. So between the first 1924 and the Second World War, we have a period in which very few Muslims came. After the Second World War, you have Muslims from East Europe coming, because especially from Bosnia and other places where the United States had recruited them from labor camps, actually from displaced people's camps, and they trained them with the idea of sending them to Russia to fight, but then they didn't know what to do with them, so they brought them to the United States. The United States recruited people from Muslim world after 1952, because that's when the United States went into the business of trying to blunt the spread of communism in Muslim countries. And so we have a lot of propaganda based on that, and they recruited students to come and study for their a master's degree or PhD degree in the United States. And some of these people did not go back. And then after 1965, we have the major immigration when the United States abolished the Asia Exclusion Act. And then we begin to have people from Asia coming in, like Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and more Iranians. So we have different waves.
Professor Haddad, how many Muslims or how many Arabs are in the U.S. at this time?
That is a contestable number. Nobody knows. In Arabic, they say Allahu A'lam, which means God knows best, because nobody has counted them. The mosques estimate that there are about somewhere between 7 and 11 million. Some of the surveys, like Pew and some Jewish organizations, say they may be about 2 million. The Arab Christians say that there are 3 million Arab Christians in the United States. And of course, their number is increasing now with the influx of Iraqi Christians and displaced people from Palestinian Christians. And so, as the Middle East is emptying out of Christians, because we have over 1 million Coptic Christians from Egypt who have emigrated. I mean, they've not all come to the United States, they've gone to Canada, Australia, Europe. But there is a process of emptying of Christians out of the Middle East. So when we talk about, because of the situation, political situation in the Middle East. And so as a result, there are questions whether Christianity will survive in the Middle East, because Syria now has some problems and people are worried about the Christian population in Syria. So after the Arab Spring in Egypt, what you have is fear among Copts. And so anybody who had relatives in any of the Western countries just tried to get out of Egypt. And of course, in Iraq, as a consequence of our liberation of Iraq, what you have is attacks on some Christians, so they've emigrated.
Professor Haddad, is there such a thing as a Muslim identity in the U.S.?
I think there are several Muslim identities. I mean, if you come to my class, you will see that it's there. I have a Saudi student who would have a Wahhabi identity. I have an Iranian student who would have a Shiite identity. I have a Palestinian student who is more secular, but he's Muslim secular, if you can think of that. So,
what does that mean?
To him, it means that he can feel comfortable living in America, at the same time maintain his beliefs. He can separate between the two. There are other Muslims who believe that your primary identity should be Muslim, so you have to dress in a distinctive way, pray 5 times a day. Some Muslims believe they are fully Muslim. They don't pray 5 times a day. So it depends who decides what a Muslim is. They might not agree with each other on what the definition of a Muslim is.
Much like Christianity?
Absolutely. No difference.
What's a moderate Muslim?
That's somebody that George Bush was looking for. We don't know. Because George Bush divided them into good Muslims and bad Muslims. And
was that fair?
I don't know what's fair. I mean, basically, a good Muslim, according to the Bush administration, was somebody who followed our policies, somebody who did our bidding, and who did not contest what we said. And what has happened is there is a backlash on Muslim community, and I think that a lot of Americans are very apprehensive about the presence of Muslims among us. They, what we call the Islamophobia that is sort of reigning at the moment in American society. And I think people are afraid if they see a Muslim praying, they think he's bad because he's too serious. He takes his faith too seriously, so potentially he is a terrorist. And I think that American society, because of what we have, which is an Islamophobia industry, people who make a living out of demonizing Islam, and there are quite a few of them.
Such as?
Well, You have Daniel Pipes, you have Gellner. I mean, there's a whole list of them. There was a study recently that showed that they got something like $40 million. So there are also Muslims who make money out of demonizing Islam. They become the native informers. They go around, you know, like there's somebody called Jasser, there's Salman. I mean, there's a whole list of them. And they go around saying, I'm Muslim, I know they hate you. And they give them money. So people make a living out of it. So who decides what's a good Muslim? I don't know. Is it somebody who demonizes Islam? Is it somebody who takes his religion seriously? According to some Muslims, you know, you have to follow the faith. Is it somebody who renounces the Sharia, which is, you know, what our current group of people running for office in the Republican Party want? I mean, Gingrich wants to ban the Sharia. It's very interesting. Sharia, in the Quran, it says you have to pray 5 times. That makes it Sharia because it's God's decree. So if somebody has to renounce the Sharia, has to renounce Islam.
After 9/11, did the attitude toward Muslims changed, or had that been building?
I think it was starting to build after the fall of the Soviet Union, because we begin to have people casting about for who's the next enemy the United States is going to have, and get somebody like Huntington, who talked about the clash of civilization, and he went around the whole Middle East talking about it, and it brought a response from, for example, Iran, which talked about the dialogue of civilizations. You know, let's talk together, let's get together, let's work together towards a better world. But 9/11 sharpened this. And I think it's not so much 9/11 as the propaganda that surrounded the war, which was necessary if you're going to energize the American people to support the war and to have trillions of dollars poured into a war and, you know, thousands of American young people killed in the project. You have to justify it somehow. So you know, I'm not saying that Al-Qaeda did not hate us. I'm not saying that bin Laden didn't want to kill us. All I'm saying is the hype for the war generated a great deal of hostility towards Islam, and now it has sort of morphed into an industry. So whenever it lags a little bit, there are people pouring money into it.
What about the phenomenon of suicide bombers, though?
Suicide bombers are a very interesting topic. I mean, if you look at some of the articles that have been written, they claim that, you know, I saw one about the Palestinian suicide bombers, that they do this because they can't afford to get married, so they do it in order to have houris. It's sort of instant gratification of sex. They can get into heaven right away. I think we have to look at it as people who are desperate and people who don't know how else to, you know, cope with what they feel is extreme oppression. I sometimes talk about the Samson model. People don't like to hear it. You know, I grew up in the Christian church, right? I'm Christian. And in the Sunday school, we always learned Samson is a good guy. And Samson killed thousands of people. And why is it justified in the Bible? Because he was oppressed, he was disempowered, he was mocked. And the Palestinians are in that condition. And they feel like there is nothing they can do. So some of them say, give me F-16s and Abrams tanks, and then we can have, you know, an equal war. But if I can't do anything, what else can I do? I lash out and say, you know, hear me. I'm not justifying it, but I'm explaining where it's coming from. It's coming from this great feeling of, is there anything I can do to relieve this oppression that I experience?
Does U.S. policy toward Israel play a role in this, Professor Haddad?
Major role. I think the U.S. policy towards Israel is creating enemies for us throughout the Muslim world. Because what we're sanctioning in Israel is against most of our values as Americans. And we talk about freedom, Christians and Muslims in Israel don't have freedoms. For example, there are 45 laws on the books in Israel that discriminate against Christians and Muslims living in Israel precisely because they are Christian and Muslim, because the state, as a Jewish state, privileges Israeli citizens who are Jewish. And so they can't buy houses someplace. I once had a discussion with a rabbi, and I asked him, he kept saying, but they run for office, and you have one Arab Israeli who is serving in the Knesset. But the question I asked him, which he didn't like at all, is would the Jewish community in the United States like the same laws that are imposed on Christians and Muslims in Israel be imposed on them in the United States? If we declare the United States as a Christian country, would they like the same laws if it's so wonderful? And he got very mad at me, because of course they wouldn't like them. They can't buy houses where they want to. In fact, if they build a house, it might be demolished, might be appropriated, but basically because of this distinction between a national and a citizen, and the privileges are for Jewish citizens.
What's the takeaway in your book, Becoming American, ?
I was looking, the takeaway is that they are trying very hard to become American. The question is whether American society is ready to accept them, and on what terms. And I sort of used to look at Muslims as being accepted into American society in line with how the Catholics and the Jews were really, despised in early America. And eventually, now if you look at the Supreme Court, we have 9 justices of the peace. Not one is Protestant, right? All these people that were despised a century ago now tell us what America is about, right? I don't know whether a Muslim is going to be a member of the Supreme Court, but that's not the question. Will the Muslims be able to integrate in such a way that nobody will raise a question about their participating in defining what America is? Then I realized that at the moment we can't look at them that way. We have to look at them in the sort of from the purview of what America does with people that it wars against. So I looked at how the U.S. treated Germans during World War I. They were, tarred and feathered. They were persecuted. Some of them were put in internment camps in North Carolina. I didn't know that, but I've been doing research, came out with that information. There were mobs that went into University of Wisconsin from where I graduated. They took all the German books and burned them. Germans disappeared. There are so many people of German background in the United States, but you don't have German American this, German American that. So they got assimilated completely. Will the Muslims be, will they have that fate? After the Second World War, we had the Japanese. They were interred. Now, I know, there was a time that the U.S. in the 1970s that was thinking of putting all Iranians and Arabs in internment camps in the South, into military bases. They didn't. And they didn't after 9/11. The third way is, the third war was against communism. And I think that that's more parallel to what is happening to Islam, is that it's being looked at as an ideology rather than a religion. Because, even though the U.S. has accepted a large group of religions, Islam still continues to be on the outside.
What's your background, Professor?
I'm from Syria. My mother was born in Antioch, my father in Tarsus. We are the original Christians of the Middle East.
And when did you come to the States? Where did you go to school?
I came in 1963. And I'm married to an Episcopal priest who is from the Diocese of Jerusalem.
And you went to school?
I went to school in Boston University School of Theology, University of Wisconsin, Hartford Seminary. I have seminary education.
And what do you teach here at Georgetown?
I teach Islamic studies and also about Arab Christians. Arab intellectuals.
How many books have you written?
I've written and edited 23.
All of this topic?
No.
Or nearby this topic?
No, I've written on Islamic concept of death and resurrection, on Muslim women, on Arab ideas. Yeah.
We've been talking with Georgetown professor Yvonne Haddad, Becoming American, The Forging of Arab and Muslim Identity in Pluralist America, published by Baylor University Press.
Thank you.
They would wear garments made of